Hello, my name is Victor Dover. I'm a town planner and urban designer with Dover Cole & Partners in Coral Gables, Florida. John Massengale and I made a presentation about street design for the 34th Congress for the New Urbanism, CNU 34, in Northwest Arkansas in the spring of 2026. So here's a quick re-record of that presentation. Now, as a practitioner and a teacher, I have gradually come to believe that street design is the one thing we can least afford to get wrong, and yet it is the one thing most often gotten wrong. So today, we're going to talk about some of what we learned by writing a big fat book and then updating it. About a decade ago, my co-author John Massengale, who's an architect in New York, and I came out with our book on street design. We researched and visited many hundreds of streets around the world, and we called upon some of our most trusted colleagues to contribute case studies about particular streets. Now, we've just finished a much expanded, totally revised second edition, with a new foreword by Carlos Moreno and a new afterword by Liz Plater-Zyberk. After measuring and arguing and photographing and staying up late thinking about so many streets, we arrived at a core understanding that streets must be places where people want to be, a natural habitat for the human species. That means we're not simply building a facility for moving back and forth, for circulating, but we're creating addresses and their communications devices. We derived 5 things that streets where people want to be always require. Our inheritance after 3,500 years of city building includes all kinds of streets that have proven, adaptable, enduring, relevant ideas. From China to Rome, there are measurable, repeatable patterns. So one of the things we learn is that streets are communications devices. They don't just help us move back and forth. They send messages. From Brooklyn to Bologna, the building-to-street relationships are identifiable and replicable. And so when we look back at streets like the Rue de Rivoli in Paris, and we remember the time when our nations were better at city building, we see our civilizations on planet Earth were building great streets. Lately, Paris has been transforming the Rue de Rivoli again, rebuilding that great street to make it even greater for a new era. We realized as we approached the second edition that our European peers are farther ahead, a lot farther ahead than U.S. cities. And so we felt some sense of urgency to get a new version of the book out and help people understand just how much better and how much more equitable and accessible our streets could be. Let's start with a core component from the first edition. We derived 5 features that streets where people want to be always require. Those 5 characteristics, the characteristics of streets where people want to be, are pretty easy to remember. First, they must be shaped. That's a necessary degree of spatial enclosure, like a public room, where the vertical parts, the buildings and the trees, serve as the walls, or the spatial definers of the room. Second, they must be comfortable, designed around the climate and the biome to make our fragile species feel welcome there throughout the seasons. Third, the streets where people want to be are the ones that go somewhere, facilitate exploration in a permeable network. Fourth, they must be safe, including safety from motorists when we share the space with them, and including safety that comes from what Jane Jacobs called eyes on the street. And last, and most elusively, the best streets touch us emotionally because beauty and human creativity are memorably on display. So we've added a lot of things to the new edition of the book, and here are some of them. There's a case study on the streets of Tel Aviv written by Yodan Rofe. There's a report from Toulouse in France from our friend Nicholas Boyd-Smith at Create Streets. Robin Williams from the Savannah College of Art and Design wrote, yes, a history of pavement, and it's fascinating. We include a lot of new case studies. I'll just mention a couple of those to you. One of them is Clematis Street in West Palm Beach, which was recently rebuilt. And a second is Riverside Drive, for which John has written the definitive design history, and we'll present that to you momentarily. The streets of Tel Aviv, great case study. Patrick Geddes, the amazing British planner who traveled the world, came to Tel Aviv and prescribed a street pattern, which you can see here in a map drawn by Robin Crowder for the new edition. And Yodan Rofe reports on the history of how Tel Aviv went from garden suburb to modern city. There were a few interesting things. If you look closely at the plan for Tel Aviv, you can see north-south streets, which he called the mainways, which are the most important, most connected streets. Think of the avenues in Manhattan, for example, that lead lengthwise across the island. And then the intersecting streets on the east-west, he called the homeways. These were connected, yes, still, but they tended to be shorter in length, they had more T-junctions, they had smaller blocks, and a less regular pattern, discouraging cut-through traffic. The case study on Toulouse by Nicholas Boy-Smith gets at not just what's happening down on the ground in the surface treatments of the rebuilt streets, but also what's going on in the building-to-street relationships. Some of the pictures from Toulouse remind us of the importance of elegant simplicity. You can actually see the muted palette here, grays on grays, pretty mild. They're not encouraging the viewer to look down and think, oh, what an interesting street design some streetscape interventionist came and did. Instead, they just feels natural and like it might have always been that way. Robin Williams' case study or report, really on the history of pavement, has this interesting graphic which shows the amount of the streets in various U.S. cities that were using which kinds of pavement. My favorite picture from Robin's essay is actually this one from the 1970s from Wilmington, North Carolina. And what you see here are the citizens of an older neighborhood taking matters into their own hands and getting out on the street and removing the asphalt from on top of their classic street bricks. Now let's talk about Clematis Street. A limited menu of street types just won't cut it. So when Mayor Jerry Muoyo, who was the former mayor of West Palm Beach, asked us to redesign the main street in West Palm Beach, we had to look beyond functional classification. It's the historic Main Street, and like many of them, it got widened and disfigured over time. And there was a round of improvement, and they eventually came back to two-way travel. But the portion of the street space devoted to people and walking and seating and trees was still far too meager. So here's how the new Clematis Street looks. It's slow and safe and curbless and shady. The aerial photograph shows how we redesigned it to deliver a much larger percentage of the space from building face to building face to people, and much less of it to the moving and storing of cars. There are cars and trolleys circulating when they want that, but many times it's an open street closed to cars, and the whole right-of-way is open to people. That inspired the Downtown Development Authority in West Palm Beach to commission a pattern book for the flexible use of the public realm, guiding the various ways to reduce or remove the cars from downtown streets from time to time, taking advantage of the curbless cross-section. There's some views from that report. That flexibility turned out to be very important during the pandemic, when the businesses needed to move activities once found only inside buildings to the outside. So we're fixing main streets like Clematis, or more importantly, healing the scars in our cities with freeways to boulevards transformations like this one in Syracuse. And so we need that bigger menu of street types now more than ever. Now, after measuring and photographing and arguing at so many streets and making that list of about 5 characteristics of streets where people want to be, we thought only appropriate to add a new list, top 10 countdown of the basic ingredients of car optional neighborhoods. And I'll walk you through what some of those are using the example of the Bend in Chattanooga, Chattanooga's first car optional neighborhood. First, bringing things closer together. Second, designing slow and safe and highly walkable and bikeable streets. The third, laying out small blocks and interconnected webs. Requiring street-oriented, street-shaping architecture and generous, green, comfortable public spaces. Planting street trees and then planting more street trees. Sixth, connecting to the surroundings via high-quality bike infrastructure, incorporating trails, cycle tracks, and elegant protected bike lanes. Seventh, optimizing for new mobility. Now, we had all the way to number 7 before I mentioned anything about technology, but we need to anticipate rideshare and bike share and scooters and car share, electric and autonomous vehicles, delivery bots, ultra compact vehicles, whatever's next. Eighth, right-sizing parking, having just enough, not too much, eliminating minimum parking requirements is a good start. Ninth, incorporating showers and covered secure bike parking in many workplaces. And 10th, developing around a transit-connected mobility hub that'll link the neighborhood to the region. That rich, varied inheritance I spoke about a little while ago of all the different ways we might make streets that are illustrated in the book was undercut about 80 years ago by the traffic engineer standards, where the world of streets was boiled down to just 3, the arterial, the collector, and the local road. That same system recognized only 2 contexts, if you can call it 2, the rural, by which they meant suburban, and the urbanizing, by which they also really meant suburban. The local, the collector, and the arterial. They all add up to one core assumption, which is that people are expected to drive, usually alone, everywhere, every time, for everything. And if you're not doing that, you probably feel like you're doing it wrong. So the worlds of city planning and transportation engineering and infrastructure funding were all retooled around that assumption. So in the spirit of observing, documenting, and sharing patterns, we've added a new catalog, 10 essential street types, to the second edition of Street Design. This covers a pretty wide range, as a starter kit at least. We start with the rarest but most sensitive cases, like the widest streets that serve a citywide or regional function, and then, but they still have to serve as dignified addresses in an urban neighborhood, like those grand boulevards and avenues and promenades. And then we work our way through to many more ordinary, somewhat narrower streets like main streets and high streets and their neighbors. Then we look at garden streets, the slowest streets, and the pedestrian-only streets, even in the suburbs. We finish with the drives and parkways at the edge of the neighborhood and beyond the town. So the catalog is set up with a series of paired types on facing pages with labels and basic descriptions. And then for each of the street types in the catalog, we created a detailed computer model of the basic conditions of the type. We use those to make the illustrations of the 28 variations in the book, what I call the starter kit. Since then, we've been using the same models to create animations and new variations, so readers can link from the ebook or visit street.design to see the street from more angles and get an idea how it works. For example, starting with the big but rare, we modeled a classic multi-lane, multi-way boulevard as evolved by the Parisians and then in Brooklyn by Olmsted. And for some of these, we start with the trees turned on, so you can see how Olmsted and Haussmann saw these as park-like green corridors. And then we take the trees off, so you can see the pattern on the ground plane, and then put them back on so that you can see how it all goes together as a kind of combination of Great Street and linear park. The genius of the multi-way boulevards, as Alan Jacobs and Elizabeth McDonald point out in their books, is the ability to reconcile through-going movement with local life. This is a big, hard-working street and pretty rare. So that was the multi-way. Now here's an avenue in the core of the metropolis. We looked into the nomenclature, and there's a long tradition of calling things whatever somebody felt like calling it. So we'll point out that there's actually a difference between an avenue and a boulevard. The big distinguishing factor is that an avenue is terminated by a building or a monument, let's say, while the boulevard goes through, framed by its tree lines. Now next we look at promenade streets, such as the Commonwealth Avenue pattern and the Rambla pattern. But then we look closely at the everyday streets too, like main streets or high streets. This is a cousin to the clematis example I showed a moment ago. Wide sidewalks, a tad of on-street parking, 1 lane in each direction. Our favorite thing is to reintroduce streets that were once ubiquitous, but engineers and fire marshals have all been erased from memory, like the Giveway Street or the Yield Street. Yes, if you try to measure this in a section and add up lanes for parking and travel in both directions, you'll conclude there's not room for all that. And yet, there are many, many streets like this in our country, which simply ask neighbors to slow down, pull over behind a parked car or in a niche, and let the neighbor pass, wave and smile as they go by, and then proceed on their way. A slow and safe street type. Part of the mission is to harness street design and address making in the service of gentle densification, including, for example, row house streets, which we need to learn to build once again. Then we show some small streets for villages and hamlets, including the asymmetrical street with the occasional lean-in tree as prescribed by Raymond Unwin. That technique allows for south-facing gardens, for example. As for beloved but near-forgotten types, we include the English garden street, like you might see at Cornwall Gardens in George and London. It's a fusion of street and square, where the large shared garden is the address and makes up for the lack of private outdoor open space in the dense surrounding housing. Olmsted picked up on this, as you may know, and created an Americanized version with the park blocks in Portland. Broad Street in Oxford and similar streets in Marlborough in the UK and Augsburg in Germany provoked us to include this forgotten but useful type, the Market Street. It's just a street that widens up so that on market days, the trucks and tents can be set up in the center of the street. And then when market day is over, the center of the street can be used for parking or other functions. And then there's the Dutch. The Dutch have created a clever street type that allows cars, but is paced to match cycling. They call it a fietsstraat. Instead of dividing the vehicular part of the street down the middle into two equally wide parts, like a lane in each direction, the fietsstraat, or bike street, divides into three relatively narrow parts. Two on the sides tend to have nice smooth pavement for riding your bike, and one in the center that is rough pavement, or cobbles, or bricks. There are cars, and there is parking, but when a car needs to pass, they have to do it slowly. The Dutch use this where it's impractical to have a totally protected or separated bike lane, but they need a crucial connection in the network, say, for example, connecting two segments of trail. We also get into totally pedestrianized streets in the catalog. And then here is a car-free green street that is like a classic residential street in the streetcar suburbs, an American garden street. But since the vehicles are served by the alleys behind the houses anyway, on the street side, all the asphalt is removed, replaced with a linear green. This was realized at Baldwin Park in Florida. We also got to document mid-block arcades and step streets and pedestrian passages, like the tiny laneways that parallel the big streets in Melbourne, Australia. My colleague Robin Crowder, who assisted in creating the catalog of essential street types, built elaborate 3D models, which you might find useful, and then we made the animations from those models. Given the push to adapt coastal cities to climate change and sea level rise, we add canal streets to the menu, including the urban type that we associate with the Low Countries in Holland and Belgium. And then we introduce an intimate, lush type that we used at Ion in South Carolina. This was almost just an underground pipe, just plumbing, and we got to build a canal instead. We were able to make it into an address. So many variations are possible. That staple American garden street I mentioned provides an interesting example. Let's take this one. This is a neighborhood in Rogers, Arkansas, we designed called Warren Park. We needed a street that could serve as the natural connection to the regional trail system. So we created a version of the American Garden Street that has 1, 2, 3 tree lines instead of just 2. And then we used one pair to create an alley for the trail. So this is like an American Garden Street with the front porches facing shallow dooryards or front yards and paired trees on both sides of the carriageway. This one has a third tree on what replaces the sidewalk on one side, a supersized sidewalk, if you will, as a multi-user trail. And so here's a look at how that might work. I hope you can see from that example how the starter kit in the catalog might be used to unleash 1,000 more variations anywhere the experience of place matters. The catalog wraps up with 2 green types at the edge of the neighborhood and beyond. A drive, according to Lexicon, is a street with buildings on one side or the city on one side and the park or the waterfront on the other side. The most classic example is Riverside Drive in Manhattan, and John Massengale wrote what I'm sure will become known as the definitive design history of this great street. The book has come out, so you've got a first sneak peek. If you'd like to see the videos, you can go to the street.design website and take a look there. We want you to take that book to your meeting with the Transpocracy. Thanks very much.